So to get started, first let's do a brief introduction of everyone so that people know who we are. Alan?
Alan Pratt, Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association, based out of Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Hobart Harmon, work with Intermediate Unit 8 in Pennsylvania. We have a couple exciting projects going on there. Some past experience relate to being Associate Director at the Area Clearinghouse for Rural and Small Schools and working in NSF projects, the rural systemic initiatives in different places in the country, and leading a couple I3 grants investing in education innovation.
Thank you. And I'm Jerry Johnson. I am the Lydia E. Skeen Endowed Chair in Education at Kansas State University and Chair of the Educational Leadership Department. I'm the former Research Director of the Rural School and Community Trust. So let's start by talking about how we define rural and why it's important to think about what rural means and how we define it.
I'll take the first stab at, I guess, at defining rural. You know, at the National Rural Ed, we define it as if you think you're rural, if you feel like you're rural, then you're rural. So that's our non-research definition. Mm-hmm. We kind of look at it like it's a sense of feeling, place, context of what your experiences, what you grew up with, or what you experienced moving to a rural community, the work in the rural community, the play, the relationships, and the interesting kind of people you meet in rural communities. That kind of all defines what rural communities are. It's not perfect. It's not always beautiful, but it's a pretty interesting place.
So what we've learned over the years is that rural has different meanings to different people. And those meanings are valuable as it comes to trying to provide education programs and policies and other kinds of issues. Usually rural is associated with sparsity, small scale kinds of institutions. We know in the last decade or so, of course, diversity is becoming more important as people move to different places, particularly with educational opportunities. So while people don't have a clear definition of rural, and if you try to define it, you'll bog down quickly in thinking that that is going to be helpful in arriving at a solution, it's more important to understand specific places and the populations there and the history about the places as we try to innovate solutions to important educational challenges.
And I would just add that there are technical definitions of rural that are useful for grouping and organizing data and conducting research. But the more important understanding of rural for me is that it's more than geography, that it's this intersection of geography with the social and cultural and economic history of a particular place, and all those things. You know, intersectionality is a term that gets used a lot in talking about individuals and their multiple identities. It can also be applied to places and regions, and I think that's the best way to understand rural, is this intersection of all of these different facets of life and how people experience those.
Yeah, and add one thing. Yeah. I think the school, when you're defining, it has to be a large part of that kind of intersection you talked about, which is important. And I know we've all talked about in the past about places that have lost their schools or and how important that is to their culture, their relationships, and what they look at as rural. So that's a good point.
That's I remember teaching a class once where one of the projects was to do kind of a profile of your school or your district, and there was a historical component to that. And of the 18 or so people in this graduate class in ed leadership, probably 2/3 of them, as part of telling the history of that place, there was a story about consolidation or school closure. It was sometimes 20 years old, but it still really defined their understanding of their community. And it was because of what the school meant to the community and what it meant to the community when something happened to the school. It went away or it consolidated. I know places around the country where the consolidation took place 20 years ago and people still wear T-shirts from the school that hasn't existed for 20 years. That's still how they identify.
Yeah, and the community identifies, I know the community I grew up in, they consolidated 76, 77, and you still have people wearing the old shirts like you're talking about, which I think is very important.
Yeah. I think along that same line, we've got perhaps the greatest gap in history between young and old. And many of us recognize the disproportionate representation of older people in rural places, because young people have been leaving those places for educational opportunity primarily for several decades. And so the issue of how you transition those places with all the challenges of the economic demands and the advancing technology and so forth, there are considerable opportunities there. But I wanted to mention one item that sometimes gets overlooked about the issue of diversity in rural America, and that is, it's partly tied to the definition, if you're seeking one, but the issue of geographic diversity in how certain segments of our ethnic or race populations live in certain places proportionately in the United States. For example, we know 90 to 95% of the rural African American youth live in the Southeast. We know that the rural white poor, typically it's Appalachia, the Ozarks up in Maine, and some other places. We know the Four Corners area, the Native American Indian population, the Hispanics and Latinx and so forth in the Southwest, though typically history is critically important, as is modern economic development, to why people live in certain places and their values that are associated with that and so forth. And so we can't forget that, but recognizing there are concentrations of populations and ethnicities become critical, I think, particularly as we look at the future of how do we deal with social justice issues, injustice issues, or other kinds of sustainability challenges. Then I'm a firm believer you have to identify the problem and recognize the context it's in if you're going to try to really solve it.
It's a great point. And you reminded me in describing that of a project we did at the Rural School and Community Trust probably 10 or 12 years ago, where we created a national map of the 900 highest poverty rural school districts in the U.S. When you do that, they sort into these geocultural clusters with really distinct identities. And what you see when you look at that map is that southeastern Kentucky looks a whole lot more like Tennessee and Virginia than it looks like central Kentucky. You can kind of, when you look at a map like that and you're thinking about where rural people live and what their common experiences are, you can kind of throw the state boundaries out.
Yeah.
And you begin to see where the clusters of people are who've had similar life experiences, who have some of those shared values and experiences. And we don't do a very good job, in my experience, in approaching the work of supporting and sustaining rural communities and rural schools with that in mind. We tend to think about state boundaries as the policy structures in which this stuff happens, and they're not always the most relevant.
Regional is like you're talking about. Southeast Kentucky is like identical to Southwest Virginia and Eastern Tennessee, especially Northeast Tennessee. So that's a good point.
Well, we know with the Rural Systemic Initiatives that the National Science Foundation funded, they drew similar boundaries by region, meaning states, when you look at these different places in the United States where people were poor and the consideration for ethnicities and educational challenges and so forth. Probably, though, too, it's critical that we recognize not only if you're going to address the problem, you have to have the people involved in ways that are meaningful. Not only those who think they have a solution, but those who are being affected by the problem. So you can be much worse off. The old saying is, of course, if you're poor and so forth, you're better off to be poor among a rural population that's wealthy than you are one that's poor, because you could be greatly disadvantaged if you're among the most impoverished in places that really have few resources. So how we look at identifying problems and recognizing the context of the concentration of the numbers that's there, but also there can be very few people that may have serious issues that will fall through the cracks if we just assume that it couldn't be a problem.
Good point.
Let's extend that a bit. Why are rural communities and specifically rural education vital to the country?
I mean, it's the backbone of our country. I mean, I think of rural schools and communities, far as feeding the country, as far as educating and innovation and innovative students that are problem solvers. I think defending our country. A lot of our folks, a lot of our rural schools and communities, a pipeline to the military. It's they always talk about in DC about checks and balances, and you got to have checks and balances so one party can't be or vice versa. I think a lot of times the rural communities are checks and balances for our country sometimes, good and bad. But a lot of times in a good way to bring us and ground us to more being centralized and where we need to be. And an open-mindedness that a lot of people don't appreciate or don't understand about rural communities. Not perfect, like we said, but it's still pretty interesting place.
So the notion of why people think they should care about rural America, and that's been a question that rural sociologists and others have tried to answer for 40 years or so. And the answer seems to move with how our society is able to communicate and deal with traditional stereotypes, whether it's through Hollywood movies or what used to be common in the newspaper. Now it's the internet and social media and so forth, and how the larger population of urban America, which far exceeds the population in rural, of course, some of the real concerns about its value. COVID obviously has exposed that food and fiber is important. We see meat prices and other things related to just survival that we need that typically have come from rural places. On the other hand, the one thing it shut down that a lot of Americans came to identify as the value of rural America is recreation. A lot of people, 40 to 50 million people in this country, see the beaches along the coast as something they identify with as an amenity, and they see rural America that way. And I often encourage people to, when they're going to the beach, start looking about 15 miles or so before you get there, and you'll see who the real people are that live and work to provide those services you enjoy. Look, see what kind of houses they're living in and so forth. And so there are places where the amenities identify with why they value rural places. There are places where the notion of family and faith and so forth carries more of a value. There are those that argue that rural America is a core example of how democracy should function, where it functions well. Now, we know there are places where there needs to be more people of difference involved in conversation and so forth. But there are some places in this country where small places, people truly collaborating and working together to do the so-called common public good, that demonstrate the best of how we can have communities that come together and so forth. So it depends a little bit, I think, on why we value rural America. For example, we know the balance of payments in this country has been largely positive because of the transfer and sale of agricultural products. So some people confuse rural America's value as being only agricultural, when in fact there's been a major effort for 20 or 30 years to have a broader rural development policy. Doesn't mean agriculture isn't important, or farmers and the large number of other occupations that are associated with that, but it's becoming clear how agriculture is very important and how other issues related to manufacturing, economic development, and particularly a focus on regional development and how communities learn to collaborate and work together instead of compete with each other is going to be critical in the future.
It strikes me, in hearing you talk about amenities and those desirable aspects of rural communities that give people a reason to want to live someplace because of the kind of quality of life they get, where family's at the center, where community life, that opportunity to participate in the community is maybe more important to people than, having access to certain kinds of restaurants or coffee shops. Do you think that some of the changes that we've seen in recent years, some of them caused by COVID, but that are likely to stay around, with people's ability to work remotely, the fact that you don't have to live and commute every day to the office where you work, Do you see that as having an impact on people's ability to make that choice, to have that rural lifestyle that they want?
I do. I mean, I think you look at it from the sense of cost of living. I think the ability to be, you mentioned, to be involved and be engaged in the education of their children, but also in the community itself, and to feel like, you want to give back. And we know that, I think prior to pandemic, there was 20% of folks in rural communities probably doing rural remote telecommuting. I'm sure that's way higher now. And I think you see these communities that are connected, that do a good job of marketing themselves. They're reaching out to those people and those families to move to their area and to establish roots. Housing is the issue, I think, when you look at rural communities, that a large part of our housing is owned by adults that are older in age or retirement age, and that transition of housing has got to be somewhat worked through to make these rural communities even more vibrant for people to move to.
I just wanted to add how the evidence is starting to evolve. We're going to have more generational impact out of this COVID experience maybe than some people have thought about. In other words, if you look at history, obviously people who experienced the Great Depression learned and acted a certain way for a generation throughout their lifetime. It's the same way with those that were in World War I, World War II, or anything of major consequence that way. So if you look at the current generation and see how since 9/11, the generation has been largely impacted by the issue of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Then they, of course, had the Afghan-Iraq wars. Now they have COVID. So we're looking at a generational impact. And I raise that issue to say that I think it would be less than best to assume this is a temporary kind of impact. I think we're going to see people making choices about redefining quality of life. This issue of people somehow are determining they don't need to work as much, or they can stay home, or whatever, as they see opportunity, and technology is greatly advancing that. Some of us hope, of course, that the fact internet will help make it possible to live in rural places, that your job no longer defines where you have to live, that will accelerate the population of some places, though the evidence that exists suggests that's still going to be most possible where there's some proximity to urban places because of some of the resources that people have come to enjoy as the so-called standard of living. But I think people will be defining quality of life, and they will be able to do that better now than any time in history, and it will not be what they've done in the past generation that is as much a gatekeeper over how they interpret that. And that's simply to mean that there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about the concept of the American dream, that young people don't define that the same way as the older people.
But I think you bring up a good point. I think Jerry brought up a good point. Proximity used to be 45, 30 minutes away. Now we look at proximities, it's okay to be further out because of the technology, and we know that's going to change even more. Transportation's going to be better, we hope. Being 2 hours, 3 hours from a location is not bad.
It's a different world, and there's a lot of opportunity associated with that. If people can regain some concept of civic engagement and not assume that only being around people who think the way they do, which they can now isolate themselves through social media and so forth, that's going to be a challenge, I think, as we think about how we become a more considerate kind of place.
And doing that work of coming together, people with differences, and learning with and from each other and resolving differences, it seems to me that has more potential to work on the smaller scale of a rural community than trying to attempt it with large groups of people at the same time. I think the reconciliation can start there.
You mentioned something last night, and it resonates. People in a lot of rural communities are just kind people a lot of times. They're nice, and they want to be respectful of each other. Not every stint, but for the most part. And I think that carries us a long way towards that understanding.
So let me just take a spin on some of what we've said then. What does it mean to be a teacher in a rural place? Well, one way to interpret that is there's a world of opportunity now there for the people who are coming out of teacher ed programs to see how they can be an essential part of helping communities change as well as students. Now, I don't mean that this is some person who sees themselves as purely an advocate that's coming out to change something. I'm talking about the people who want to be engaged with community and leaders and others who see that they need to respond to the issues of the times, and how students can do projects and other kinds of engagement themselves, which we're trying to get students engaged, and we know that means it's got to be something that's meaningful to them, and there's nothing more meaningful than being actually engaged in a real problem and doing it with other peers and people. So there's opportunities, I think, in small rural places for teachers to really be engaged in ways that really benefit communities and students that will take them into a future of benefit, not only in their own lives, but in seeing the bigger purpose of education as well.
Good. Two of the strongest motivations for adult learners, and teachers are adult learners, the two of the strongest motivations are the pursuit of mastery and impact, having an impact. I think working in a rural community, working in a rural school gives teachers a greater opportunity to have impact, and really importantly, to see the impact. Anybody who's ever had a conversation with a teacher will tell you, I don't do this for the money, I don't do this for any other reason, but I saw this kid 10 years after she graduated, and she told me what she was doing, and she told me how the experience she had in my 9th grade algebra class was what made all the difference in her accomplishing something like that. It just stands to reason that in a rural community, those connections among family, those connections among community members are closer and they're clearer, and there's more opportunity for people to see what their work is producing in a way that I don't know you get working in a large suburban high school with 3,000 students.
I agree. Students that were my students when I was a principal, it's good to go back and run into those students and see what they're doing and being successful. It's also good to hear that, the words that you may have brought to the table and say, hey, why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. In a part of their life, and it changed and impacted them, and you thought it was just a normal conversation. Because I remember coaches or teachers that have said things to me like, freshman year algebra, I remember Miss Canancer was her name, and she said, you're not going to do much in life if you don't master what I'm trying to get you to do in this class. You're not going to make it where you want to go. I still remember. She wrote it, called my mom, and put it on, and told me face to face. Very impactful. So,
that reminds me of one of the key challenges in a lot of how people think about rural America is through a negative lens. We mentioned stereotypes earlier, but the opportunity that exists in the future is thinking more around assets, the community capitals framework, for example, the different assets that exist in a community. And if teachers will become engaged in how they can be a part of that thinking, and administrators, of course, too, but it's more than just educators. It's people in a rural area coming together and understanding how they build on what they have, how they use it for value. And so if that is the context under which you're getting ready to enter the job of being a teacher, I'd be pretty happy in thinking about that. If you're thinking about being a teacher from an understanding of how there's all these circumstances of poverty and people have not had opportunity for things, or they're somehow deprived of what's considered to be some other kind of middle class living, then you probably need to think about whether you fit, whether you want to be there. So that assets-based approach, I think, is critical to how people can move forward in thinking about contributing in a positive way to local rural places.
And one of those assets in rural communities is collaboration. Hobart and I are currently working on a large research project around better understanding how people do collaborative leadership in rural settings to promote rural development. I'd be interested to hear from both of you, what are some other projects that you're working on, or initiatives or programs that you think can really help to move rural education forward?
You know, one of the things that we're piloting in Colorado is a grand challenge around this prospect of bringing people to the table, and really bringing the economic side of it, the workforce side of it, and then the regional side of it together with education. It just started. We started this past fall, and really having I think Hobart mentioned the folks at the table that are going to be long-term, residents of those communities to really help solve those problems, but really be the leaders of those problems. So, it fits a lot of our conversation today. So we look forward to moving that forward.
There are a lot of great initiatives. One of the things that doesn't happen enough in rural places is people writing about making more known what they do. Yeah. People are so busy trying to get the work done and wearing multiple hats that they don't very often go present or write articles or things that can help expose some of the positive things. But I know the National Rural Ed Association, where Alan is closely working with the Rural Schools Collaborative organization, and they've got tremendous projects and initiatives all over the country. Where I am up at Appalachia Intermediate Unit 8, we have a trauma skills network model of increasing capacity in the region to deal with trauma. And we know that is coming in a big way. It's already here. We're partnering with the National Dropout Prevention Center that has a trauma skills specialist certification. So partly I want to make a point there about how we intentionally seek to find partners and others that can help us have solutions that achieve collective impact. We can't deal with trauma alone in education. There are lots of entities out here doing things. And so projects, though, need to take on, in many cases, a more focused kind of approach, I think, where the people most impacted are also involved in the planning. There's evaluation results that come so you know that you're actually making a difference and you can make adjustments. And be concerned with too many projects is not the answer. Sometimes it's a lot of projects that can take away the very capacity you have to do the most important things. So the notion of trying to set a priority around what are those things that's most critical to benefiting students and communities, and that's what I like about the Rural School Collaborative Initiative. I mean, they're not confused in any way as to what their purpose is. Sure. It's not an issue of chasing dollars and thinking that whatever comes out of it is a good thing. It's seeking very intentionally the kinds of activities that give kids project-based learning experiences that impact communities. And so I hope we can find a lot of those kind of places around the country where we might examine how collaborative leadership is making a difference.
Yeah. And then be able to tell that story in a way, as you were mentioning earlier, that we don't always. And calling attention to and shedding light on the innovative and effective and really creative things that are happening across rural America.
And telling that story for other districts, for other communities, but also legislators and our people, policymakers, which is important for them to know that story as well.
Yes.